talk about the fascinating topic of interoperability today. Two of us, that is. I'm Ben Dorsey of KMC Controls, and with me is Chris Hollinger of the Siemens Building Technology Group within Siemens Industry Incorporated. Chris and I have worked together actually for several years on the marketing committee of Bacnet International, so we're well acquainted with one another, and our products actually talk to one another well because of the Bacnet communication protocol that we use. But we're here today to talk about what happens when the goals of Bacnet are not achieved. What can go wrong in terms of these communications? And so that's our purpose. Now, I realize it's getting close to Halloween. My intention here is not really to scare you, but I do want to make you aware there are some very real issues related to this term of interoperability. I'll talk to you at probably what I'll call the 5,000 foot level, and Chris will bring it down to planet Earth with some very specific kind of guidelines and things to look for. So again, cloud level and ground level view of the challenges of interoperability. Now, Bacnet promises us a few things. First of all, that you'll have the opportunity to choose from several competitive brands of products. In the olden days of proprietary digital systems, which are still valid and still used in today's world, you were basically locked into a particular vendor or a particular service supplier or a particular manufacturer's products. And Bacnet says, let's open it up. Let's make all these brands fairly competitive and give owners and facility professionals a choice. And so that's our intention in the Bacnet. We also, right from the beginning, the Bacnet communication protocol designed by ASHRAE was designed to integrate various building systems. So yeah, it had a start in mechanical systems and HVAC and related, but it really does have the provision to integrate a number of building systems. And we see lots of buildings today that are integrating lighting, access, even security, even fire and smoke to some extent, plus elevators and related things. Even being integrated within very complex IT infrastructures within the buildings, so that the entire building, we have the IT infrastructure as well as all the building management integration taking place. And Bacnet provides for that kind of integration. And then finally, this word that's all important to us today, and that is that term interoperability. Now, what do we mean by that word? Let's define it. First of all, it simply means that it makes possible the interconnection of diverse pieces of equipment from various manufacturers. The implication there being that if Chris is using the communication protocol Bacnet within his Siemens product line and I'm using it within my product line, then we can talk to one another and that we get along harmoniously. Now, Bacnet is an open standard. It does not dictate any kind of hardware usage. Plenty of open seats up front here, folks. Wait, no, just a few. There's just a few open seats up front here. And we saw early on some open approaches that were dictating some particular pieces of hardware. For example, Bacnet defines what are known as devices. And a device within the Bacnet world must comply with certain functionality. So you might have a smart sensor or an advanced application controller or an operator workstation. That is a device within the Bacnet world, and that device, each one of those, has to integrate within to itself a certain degree of functionality. But Bacnet does not demand interoperability. That's the promise to you as a facility professional, that you can do so if you choose. But if you are pleased with a particular manufacturer, a particular service provider, you don't have to do an interoperable system. But today's complex buildings, and probably buildings within your portfolio built over time and retrofitted over time, have varying degrees of building systems within them, and it's important that they communicate well. Now, those were the promises. What about the non-promises of Bacnet? What does Bacnet not guarantee you? And it doesn't guarantee you a plug-and-play approach. It's not plug-and-play. Why? Because and it could be if it dictated hardware configuration. But the simple fact is, I have to configure my hardware to work in the system through my approaches and my company's approaches, and Chris has to do the same thing through his. There is no common way to configure all of the hardware. So configuration between systems can vary. Now, there are some shortcuts we can take there and some remediation, but Bacnet itself does not dictate those. There are solutions for doing that efficiently, but Bacnet as a standard does not dictate. And by the same token, however, I don't like to hear the term plug and pray when it comes to Bacnet. I mean, it really does work. And we see successful installations after successful installations. So this is a tried and proven standard. I mean, we've been developing this standard since about 1995. And it's a living, breathing standard within the ASHRAE community. A cross-functional committee of people from across the industry meet together routinely, at least a couple of times a year, to develop this standard. So it is living and breathing. But it's been around a while as well. Now, by the way, if you do want plug and play, hey, go pneumatic. There's the original open system of communication, air. But it's not extremely data rich. So if you're going to go digital, I say go Bacnet. Now, having done all that, I'll encourage you, we don't have internet access in these rooms, but if you follow that hyperlink, and you can download these presentations, by the way, from the NFM&T conference site. Click on that, you'll see 40 or more case studies of and many times interoperating systems with various competitors' products, all on the same project. So success stories on the Bacnet International website. There's a big link on the homepage of Bacnet International for those as well. So I'll spend the remaining several minutes of my time talking about what I like to call dream busters. And that is why things go bad. and very often results in some finger pointing on projects. And it's easy on a complex controls related project where you're integrating various building systems and various pieces of equipment for a lot of finger pointing to occur. Well, it's their problem. No, it's their problem. I'll give you some reasons why these things exist and probably a few hints as to what you might want to be aware of to avoid these kind of dream busters. First one, and this is a tough one to talk about, but you know, various manufacturers don't always implement the Bacnet standard the way they should, quite frankly. And I'll give you a few specific points there of what the kind of things I'm talking about. And the first one is simply a matter of terminology. We use the term, and it's a semantics issue. It really is just a matter of words. But these words do become somewhat important. When we say the words native Bacnet within the Bacnet community, we mean a product that has been designed from the ground up to be Bacnet and to communicate in a Bacnet fashion. As opposed to somebody saying, well, it's Bacnet compatible or it's Bacnet capable. Equipment manufacturers were infamous for this. And by the way, they're changing and they're realizing they really need to integrate Bacnet as opposed to slap on some Bacnet control onto their piece of equipment that they've manufactured for 20 years. But these terms do become important. If you hear the term Bacnet capable or that sort of thing, it just, just perk up your ears and say, okay, I need to be a little more aware of how this company has implemented the Bacnet standard. But many of us within the Bacnet community use the term native Bacnet simply to indicate we designed this device from the start and from ground up to speak Bacnet. Membership, it's a little thing, but membership in Bacnet International is important, and we do have dozens and dozens and dozens of companies that have joined Bacnet International. This used to be called, by the way, the Bacnet Manufacturers Association, but we realized, well, it's not just manufacturers. Service providers have a great role to play here. and even individuals can even join Bacnet International. But it's kind of one of the costs of playing in the field. It's kind of one of those things you just need to do. In addition to that, Bacnet International provides a lot of resources for its members and opportunities to interact with one another. And that's why, Chris and I have been working together for, several years now on the Bacnet International Marketing Committee. So we see each other at events, we talk, and then more importantly, Bacnet International provides opportunities like this one. We call it Plug Fest, and they're interoperability workshops. Marketing people like me don't get invited to these events, by the way. It's only the technical folks within the various manufacturers, and you might have 30 or more companies show up at these events with their technical teams, and their whole purpose for a couple of days is just to sit down and test their products with everyone else's, just to make sure that communications are occurring. You can see the list on the website of ASHRAE, on the website of Bacnet.org, as well as the website of Bacnet International, of what companies are coming. And I can tell you, companies like Siemens and KMC, we go every year, and we're there testing products, making sure the communications are working. And we don't talk about it afterwards if problems occur. There's no publicity is generate, which is why they don't let marketing people like me go. But the purpose is to make a better product for you. That's the whole purpose. Yes.
Interject a little bit?
You betcha.
We attended the Plug Fest last year for the first time, and it is probably the best thing that's happening in the Bacnet community. Everyone who's there takes their company badges off. It doesn't matter who you work for, you're there to make one product work with another, and everybody just kind of rolls up their sleeves and does what they need to do and actually helps each other out.
Yeah.
Just a very, very positive environment. And one of the things that we found was that even after the event, those relationships that you've developed, just keep on supporting each other and so forth.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Steve. I appreciate it.
It's a really, really, really good event.
Well, there you have it, from a non-marketer. Agreed. And finally, here on this Dreambuster #1, which is again about the implementation of Bacnet, look for companies that pay that extra price and do that extra due diligence to test their products. The Bacnet community has a standard. It's a third-party testing laboratories, actually more than one location, of certifying the products, and they have become BTL listed. So you're looking for products that are BTL listed. Only products that are BTL listed get this little label, by the way. So if you see that label, you know that company has put its products through rigorous tests internally and then sent it off to a third-party lab who has put it through further tests and iterations and going back and forth. And these are financial investments for companies. They're time and resource-intensive investments for companies. But all to make a better product for you. So that's Dreambuster #1. Let's move on to #2. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah. How to fix Dreambuster #1. Explore Bacnet International. Go there frequently for news and updates. We do have, by the way, within the Bacnet community, a monthly e-newsletter called Cornerstones. It goes out to 10,000 plus people, and if you're not on it, get on it. Got a lot of good information there. We're even producing a new one now from our education committee called Foundations, with a lot more technical information in it. So Cornerstones, Foundations, all within the Bacnet community. Keep yourself up to date. And you can even follow us on your favorite social media channels as well. #2 issue I want to talk about is simply a matter of training. And I mean this from two different perspectives, and that is the training that your service providers bring to the table, as well as the training that you might require within your facility and that your folks might require. So again, I'm giving you reasons why I've seen issues in the field result and why interoperability is sometimes thwarted. And many times it comes down to a training issue that the technicians either doing the installing from your service provider side or your own technicians maintaining the system are not properly trained. All manufacturers provide factory direct training for their contracting partner organizations, and you should ask them to show, to illustrate their training. We've prepared within the Bacnet community, by the way, and I do have printed copies of this available, and if you'd like one, just see me afterwards. But it's simply a one-page, one side of one sheet document that says, here's how to qualify your Bacnet provider. Here's some questions you can ask. And of course, there's simple things like, well, can you give me some project references? How many projects have you done? Do you have a local project that I could see or talk to somebody about? And then we get into some more things here, which I'll get to in a few minutes. But there are questions also on here related to training. And one of those questions that you need to ask yourself as a facility professional is, what do you want to be able to do within the system? That is, do you want that service provider of yours providing all the necessary updates? What if you want to add a new graphic page to your operator workstation? Is that something you can do, or is that something you want them to do? And if it's something you want to be able to do yourself, do you have the sufficient training or knowledge of that workstation to be able to do that? So these are not deep thought kind of questions, but they are good things to keep in mind as you try to qualify somebody to be your service provider. And that's true for whether they're a manufacturer or a contracting partner to a manufacturer, a mechanical contractor, a controls contractor, an energy solutions provider. You can ask them these kind of questions. And there are a couple of points there which I'll get to here shortly. Uh-oh, what happened? So consider how much you want to be able to do, and if it's not, if you want to lean on that contracting partner, that solution provider for all these things, that's fine. But how much do you want to be able to do, and if so, do you have the necessary training to do it? Ask them what kind of training they provide. One of the questions on the sheet you just saw, by the way, talks about this notion of proprietary issues. Bacnet is an open standard, but it also is a flexible standard in this regard. Let's say that Siemens, in Chris's company, introduces a product that has new capability that nobody else has. Well, he needs to be able to make provision for that. And Bacnet allows him to do that through the use of proprietary objects and proprietary properties of standard Bacnet objects, etc. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a legitimate thing to do. And it's a thing that he needs to be provided for as an innovator of products. By the same token, many manufacturers can introduce so many proprietary processes and so many proprietary things taking place that interoperability gets in the way. Gets in the way of interoperability. So ask them. It's perfectly legitimate to ask your service provider what kind of proprietary objects, what kind of proprietary things are you trying to do here? And are you using standard data types? Because even if it's a proprietary process, there are standard mechanisms within the IT realm that say this is what we call these kind of things, this is the kind of nomenclature we use, and therefore that communication can be utilized. Inefficient network management. Chris will get into this in some detail. Here's the kind of things at the 5,000 foot level that I see pretty frequently, and that is there are network addressing issues, so many inefficiencies. We have operator workstations that are demanding so much information from the entire automation system that they're filling the pipeline with all this meaningless data. Now, an automation system is rich in data. But the operator workstation doesn't need to have it all the time. It doesn't need all of it all the time. It's perfectly legitimate to get an update from a sensor, for example, every 15 minutes as opposed to every 5 seconds. So common sense prevails here, but sometimes we see a lot of these network inefficiencies because of that. And in addition to that, the Bacnet standard is set up from what are known as properties to objects to devices. Remember I mentioned devices earlier. A device incorporates a number of objects and properties. And by the same token, services and Bacnet interoperability building blocks. That's the BIBs. Should be a small s there. Bacnet interoperability, these are higher functions, and those higher functions make a Bacnet device work much more efficiently and make Bacnet system work much more efficiently. So therefore, investigate how much they are utilizing these higher functions. And now, I'll turn it over to this young man, Chris. Oh, any questions or comments about anything I discussed? We'll take more questions at the end, but okay.
All right. Hello, everybody. So, name's Chris Hollinger, and I work for Siemens. And I'm here today, essentially, as Ben has said, to really help educate our audience and our facility owners about how great, powerful Bacnet is, and how we have a lot of responsibility to apply it effectively. I think the standard is extremely powerful. But it's up to us to make sure that we're educating folks, the consulting engineer community, our customer base, ourselves, to properly apply the standard, because it's all in the application. If it's applied properly, it's extremely powerful. If it's misapplied, folks unfortunately will have a bad taste in their mouth because they believe that Bacnet doesn't work. And we've run into that over and over again, where there's this perception that Bacnet doesn't work because vendor A's product doesn't talk to vendor B's product. And there's a misperception that it's plug and play, that magically these two devices, if you just put the wires together, they'll start talking to each other. Well, there's some truth to that, but by and large, these are still engineered systems. And because they're engineered systems, they require a lot of forethought. They require a lot of planning, and they certainly require engineering expertise to apply them correctly. Does that make sense to everybody? So really, just because it's a standard language doesn't mean that we divorce ourselves from our responsibility to engineer these systems properly. True in the proprietary world, very, very true in the Bacnet world. And I would even say this, I would say that our engineering is even more critical in the Bacnet world, because to a certain extent, proprietary systems, because we always knew what devices were going to talk within our little universe of devices, we could take liberties. We could make them almost plug and play because we knew who was on our network. Bacnet is a little bit different story. Bacnet, we can have vendor A's devices, vendor B's devices, vendor C's devices. Requires us to be much more flexible, which is very powerful, of course, but flexibility can also breed a certain amount of complexity. And that complexity means that consulting engineers, customers, ourselves as vendors have a lot more responsibility to plan appropriately. Does that make sense? So that's really the message here. Bacnet works great, but we have to apply it properly. So Bacnet's just a language. That's my kickoff here, and I want to emphasize the fact that it is just a language. Don't misunderstand what it represents. It represents a language, very powerful language, but it's just a language. It's not a system. It's not devices that are, as Ben said, built from the ground up with the exact same hardware from KMC, from Siemens, etc. We have our own ability to create the hardware, even the functionality that applies for our system. So it's just a language. So with that, what are the top 5 interoperability headaches that I believe and I hear from our customers that really, I guess, we should be responsible and understand what they are and identify them and make sure that they don't happen. So this is a bit of a tutoring of what to look for, what to watch out for, and how to avoid these interoperability headaches. First off, timing. no doubt that timing is probably the number one issue that we typically hear about when it comes to interoperability problems, headaches. What do we mean by that? What we mean by that is essentially that when you have devices talking to each other, there's a certain expectation that there's a response to a request, and that's going to happen in a certain time frame. If those requests and responses don't happen within the time frame that's expected, then all of a sudden the two devices assume, he's not talking to me. I'm just gonna stop talking, essentially. So when that happens, the customer sees, hey, my system's failing. My device over here is failing. My sensor's failing. I'm not getting an update on this piece of information I'm expecting. So that's when, essentially the alarm bells go off and my system looks like it's not functioning. Well, in actuality, what's happening is because the timing is not matched appropriately, you're essentially just getting miscommunication amongst those devices. So that's a very important factor, something to really try to minimize. The tough part about this one is that Ben mentioned BTL, how strong and powerful BTL is as far as testing our products. But because a test lab is different than a actual customer site, these timing issues cannot really be represented within a test lab. A test lab is device to device. Are we communicating properly? Are we sending the right bits and bytes across the wire? Great, wonderful. Get the BTL certification, fabulous. But we all live in the real world. The real world can potentially have hundreds and thousands of devices on a network. There's no way in the world BTL will ever be able to represent that type of a system. So that is why timing becomes a critical issue. And it's also why it's important for us to bring this up and make sure that we're all aware that we have a responsibility to engineer our systems appropriately and with this in mind. Next is communication format is not quite right. And I would say in general that the BTL standard does make sure this doesn't happen. If you have a BTL certified product, this generally speaking should not be an issue. However, it is possible that even with a BTL certified device, you might have noise on the wire that potentially could disrupt the packets that are coming across the wire. So even with BTL certified devices, it is possible to have an issue like this, where you have a malformed packet on the wire. But in general, like I said, if it's BTL certified, generally speaking, shouldn't be an issue. If it's not BTL certified, then this is absolutely something to look for. And the way you look for it, I'll talk about some ways to diagnose these issues later on. But essentially, the best way to diagnose it is to capture the information on the wire. That's really the only way to capture it. Capture the information on the wire and diagnose what exactly is the communication format of that packet. If it's wrong, then you can see it right away. Now, of course, you have to be trained to be able to look for these kinds of things. So if you're not, then certainly make sure that your service provider, your vendor is well trained on that capability. All right? Next up is object name conventions. And object name conventions can take on a couple different forms. One is just pure usability. From a usability perspective, the customer sees an object on a graphic, sees an object name in a report, sees an object in an alarm, sees an object in a schedule, and that needs to mean something. Too often we see vendor object names that when they're brought into the system, they look essentially meaningless, meaning that they're information that maybe is useful for the vendor that put them together, but for day-to-day perspective, take a guy off the street essentially who's monitoring a system but not real familiar with the vendor product, they don't necessarily know what that representation of that object name is. So be very careful about the devices that you bring into your system. Make sure you understand how they represent the object name in that system. Make sure it's useful for you, and if it's not, that you can change it. So that's a key point, because if you see a point on a graphic that means nothing to the user, that's not very useful, right? It's not going to be an effective solution at the end of the day. And then the other aspect that this can take on is there are certain guidelines within systems as far as the number of characters, the types of characters that are used in the system. So if you have constraints in those characters that are not abided by both sides, that also can cause problems as well. So I'll get into some more specifics, but that's the basics. Next up, number 4 is insufficient device network documentation. This is a big one. This all comes down to planning. Yes, question?
Yeah, so we found that other vendors, I'm an installer.
Yep.
Using the wrong network number, so not using their Bacnet address, this is job 24, I'm gonna use 24 to start this job.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. So this all comes down to planning, and the fact of the matter is this is something that can 100% of the time be prevented. So it's up to us to make sure there's education out there, make sure there's the knowledge of this issue, and make sure that we have the tools to effectively make sure this doesn't happen. And so make sure if you're installing Bacnet systems that you very carefully document and plan for exactly what network numbers are used by which systems, and device addresses need to be used very carefully. If you think about the way this architecture works, it's just like a mail system. You need to have a unique address within a unique town, otherwise you will not get your mail. Same thing here. You need the town is essentially the network number, and the device ID is your street address. And if you have duplicates, or if you have misunderstood or unknown device IDs and numbers, you're going to have a lot of problems. So plan it, make sure that you're well documenting these addresses, and this really goes away. But it's a big deal because unfortunately that planning doesn't always happen.
Chris, let me add one more thing there. You really need to understand the pre-existing environment that you're going into too, as
Yep.
well as the system that you are planning on installing.
Absolutely.
They're going to interact, whether you want them to or not.
Yeah.
You need to know both.
Yeah, the complexity is even more apparent when you're going into an existing installation. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So you have a new installation, you have the benefit of being able to plan it from the ground up. You have an existing installation with potentially already defined addresses. That makes it even more important to make sure you're planning. Absolutely. And then the final one is function mismatch. And this gets down to, Ben started talking about the picks and the bibs, which nobody really wants to talk about, but the fact of the matter is that is an important element here. And what picks and bibs represent is the functionality that is built into those devices. So when BTL certifies a device that says, oh, this is an application-specific controller and it supports certain functions, it's basically testing that the picks and the bibs that a vendor creates matches up and is working appropriately according to the Bacnet standard. So with that, it's important for our installers or consulting engineers that when they're putting together systems, it's like a puzzle, you got to make sure that all the pieces fit together. Because if you have a missing piece, meaning a missing piece of functionality, the customer's not going to be happy if they can't figure out why they can't get an alarm out of a device, for instance. And those are the kinds of things that we have to be very careful about. If you expect to provide alarming, scheduling, trending in a system, those are all Bacnet capabilities, system-level capabilities. It's important to understand who's going to take on that responsibility, meaning which device in the system is taking on that responsibility, and make sure it has the capability to provide that functionality. And that's where the picks and the bibs come into play. So if they've been BTL certified, they will show you exactly which functions have been tested, and it takes a little bit of homework, but if you can match the functionality, you're in much better shape and you won't have surprises later on. All right, so with that, I said this was a language. And so I wanted to put it into terms of just a language, right? So we're talking English, and let's assume that these devices are talking English too, just for fun. So on the left-hand side, or in the middle, I should say, we have a workstation, we have a device on the right, and those are talking. And typically, the client workstation is going to be sending off a lot of requests. They're going to be looking for reports. They're going to be looking to send out schedule information. They're going to be consuming alarm information and acknowledging, the user's going to acknowledge alarms, things like that, updating graphics. So with all that information, essentially the two devices are, they're chatting, they're talking across the network, they're talking across the wire. Well, what's going to happen, potentially, if we're not careful, is that the client side, which is the workstation, is going to just pound this device with requests, And the device, remember, is not just a communicator. Its job is not just to talk English on the network. Its job is to work on calculations and do all its processing that it has to do, run its programs. That's its primary function. That device is not there just to communicate with its client device. That device is there to control. That's its primary function. So if you overwhelm that device with a bunch of chatter across the network, think about when somebody's talking to you and you're trying to run a calculator with a formula. How difficult is that? It's pretty difficult. Actually, it's virtually impossible, right? It's virtually impossible. And actually, processors are not really much different. Processors need to process the information that they can along that timing, and if you're overwhelming them with communication, they won't be able to control. That's a bad thing. So be careful as you design these systems, as you decide which points you want to have come across your networks. Be very careful. Don't assume that every point on the network I should just be able to see. That's the easy answer, but it's not a very good answer. The better answer is decide what information is critical to you, put it on a graphic, put it in an alarm, and make sure that you're not overdoing your requests for information from those devices. Does that make sense? So that's a big deal. All right, communication format is not quite right. Let's get into that one. Just a brief moment here. It's funny with the advent of all these little social media and text messages and things. Everybody just abbreviates information nowadays, right? You hardly ever spell out words unless it's I. So everybody's abbreviating. Well, guess what? The human brain is pretty good. We're not always the most intelligent, but we're not bad. We can interpret things quite well. So if somebody puts up a UR up there, well, you and I, we know what that means, right? We don't have to look up at a Webster dictionary and say, what in the world is UR? We can figure that out. Guess what? Computers, controllers, no, not so much. No. If a programmer puts in UR and what that means, fabulous. Knows exactly what it means. But there's no way in the world a processor is going to interpret that. That's not what they're designed to do. They can't do it. Humans are much more intelligent when it comes to that interpretation. What this comes down to is our processors in our controllers have certain expectations of the information coming across the wire. And if it doesn't meet the rules, game's over. You're not going to talk. That's it. End of story. So that's why it's so important to get BTL listing on your devices, or at least do some sort of pre-testing to make sure that you're not running into these issues of, gosh, I have a character, I have no idea what to do with that, I'm just going to quit talking. I don't like that character, I'm not going to talk to you. Right? That's what happens. That's the reality. So definitely avoid this. Next one up is object name conventions. So I give you a couple examples of what this means. In a lot of devices, you'll find that the object names can be really long, which is great because I said earlier, sometimes object names don't mean anything. If it's 3 characters, well, typically it's probably not going to be very meaningful. On the other hand, the opposite extreme is not always good either. If it's 40 characters, then it might be extremely descriptive, but it may not fit in your character set range. So that's a bad thing. So what I mean by that is essentially your workstation might have certain level of or certain number of characters it can support within a name, and if you go beyond that, it's either going to do one of two things. It's going to chop it, or it's going to represent it in another format of some sort, because it can't handle it. It can't handle 40 characters. So in general, be careful about matching these characters. Make sure that there's a name restriction, and make sure you understand the name restriction on both sides and apply rules accordingly. And then also, things like object names can have special characters in them. And the Bacnet standard says, I don't care what character you use, it could be a special character, fine, great. I'm not going to put any type of constraints. But in the real world, in most systems, there are some characters that we just don't like. And I'll give you an example, a backslash or a forward slash. Typically, that's not a very good character to use. So in some systems, that would be a non-starter. That would be a situation where that name would not be digested, if you will, by that system. okay? So just be careful about those kinds of rules because these are real world scenarios. And then the next one would be just the object name itself. Give it some name that makes sense to the user. That gets back to the whole usability issue. STPT, many users will know what that means. So great. But just as an example, be careful because not everybody's going to know what that means. If you took that to a finance guy, STPT, he'd have no idea what that means, right? So be careful about the names that you use. Next up, insufficient network documentation. Give you some examples on that. One of the things that typically will happen is the network will get really slow when you have duplicate addresses on the network or network numbers that don't coincide with exactly how the system should have been set up in the first place. And then also BBMDs, which is a term we haven't talked about yet, I don't believe, but that's the Bacnet broadcast management device. In an IP network, BBMDs are used to route messages from various subnets. So a subnet to a subnet, it's a routing mechanism to allow discovery and communication between those devices. So BBMD is extremely important, and this is set up during installation. During the initial installation, there's a BBMD list. It basically provides IP addresses of all those network routing devices, and if that's inconsistent, or if you have multiple BBMDs in the same subnet, those are the kinds of things that will bring a network down. And I'm not overstating that. If you have multiple BBMDs in a subnet, you can bring your network down. You will have very little to no communication at that point. And so be careful about these kinds of things. That's why planning becomes extremely important. When you're putting these systems together, make sure you identify what devices are BBMDs, one in each subnet, and make sure that the lists of BBMDs are consistent from device to device in that network. And if that doesn't happen, you're going to have problems. I can almost guarantee it. So next up would be, why can't I discover this device? The BBMD potentially could be something that you could look at because that does define how you can address or how you can discover a device and its objects. But also you should take a look at network number duplication. That potentially could be an issue, or also device instance duplication as well. So like I said earlier, with this whole addressing thing, we need to know the town, we need to know the street address, we need to know, in a Bacnet terms, the network number and the device ID. So make sure you're not duplicating those addresses. We should be in good shape. Any questions on what we've covered thus far? Anybody have some good examples of some of these last couple items especially? Any good examples out there? I'm sure there are some. Come on. All right, well, that's okay. You can be shy and not talk about it. But I know they happen. We get calls, unfortunately, far too often. So again, this whole message to you is understand these are the issues to be careful of, be aware of, and let's prevent them. Because they do give the customer a perception that, oh gosh, this Bacnet stuff doesn't work. Well, it does work, but we have a responsibility to make sure we're applying it correctly. So finally, function mismatch. This gets to the picks and bibs that we talked about earlier. And while those documents are not fun to look at, and I know the first time I started looking at those and trying to match up functionality, going back, 10, 12 years, I was very lost when I started looking at these things. So it's okay to be very lost looking at those documents, but make sure somebody is looking at them who actually knows what to look for. And when it comes to function mismatch, I think Ben said this very well, make sure the customer knows exactly what they want. And I know that's very difficult. It's extremely difficult. It's difficult for all of us to really put down on paper what we all want all the time because we can't really put ourselves easily in a day-to-day function for something that's maybe happening in another year or two on a pre-planned project. But do your best. Try to get the day-to-day functionality on paper, everybody to agree to it, and then that'll be the framework for understanding the functionality the customer wants and then how to apply that functionality, making sure the devices that you're choosing do support that function that the customer wants. Because that's just so important, and I see it too often where You expect an alarm to come through, alarm acknowledgement at the user workstation. Potentially that's not going to work because there's a function mismatch. The device that you're trying to get the alarm from doesn't support that alarming and alarm notification, for instance. So those are the kinds of things that's important to really think through carefully. Anybody questions? Anybody have a question on that? Okay. All right, so what are the top 3 helpful tools? Top 3 helpful tools I would say are, first off, device logs, file captures, history reports. Most systems, building automation systems, have some sort of log file, capture files that are available, and behind the scenes, they're logging a bunch of information. So on a client workstation, let's say, typically there's going to be some capturing of data, capturing of understanding what functions are happening within the system and when they happened, and also errors. It'll capture errors as well. So use those files. Now you if you're a customer out there, you may not know where they exist, but your service provider does, and they can help you find them, and they can also help you interpret them, which is very important too, because sometimes these aren't the most easy to use files, but they are there, and they can help diagnose these various issues. So that's one. Next up would be a network browser. Many device and many systems out there have what we call network browsers, and that essentially is, I call it an independent client look, if you will, or view of the system. And the advantage of this is that you may have a client workstation with graphics and alarms and all that good stuff, and something's not working. Well, it's always good in troubleshooting to have an independent, third party, if you will, take a look at the same information and see if there's a different reaction. So for instance, if I can't command a point from my graphic, my first reaction would be, let's see if I can bring up a browser, which is an independent application, and see if I can command the point that way. Because if I can command the point that way, well, then that points to there must be something going on with that application in the graphic. If I cannot command that point, well, that's 2 sources of information that tell me I can't command that object. Then I need to start looking at, is that even a commandable object at all? It may not be, or a commandable property, I should say. Commandable property, is it a commandable property? If it's not, well, guess what? You will never be able to command that property, ever. So, so those are the types of things to be careful of, to watch out for. Now, how would I know if it's commandable property or not? There's documentation in, unfortunately not in the BTL pics that you get off the website, but many vendor devices have much more detail in their pics as far as objects and properties that are writable and readable. You can take a look at that information. If it says it's readable, that means it's readable but not writable. Okay? If it says it's writable, then it's readable and writable. So those are the kinds of details that you get into when it comes time to match functionality. And again, not fun, but if you get the right people with the right eyes, you can take a look at this, make sure you don't fall into any traps. Okay? Next up would be communication wire capture. And this is definitely not for the faint of heart, but it's foolproof. It's fabulous. If you get the right people looking at the data captures on the wire, there's no hiding, right? If there's a problem on the data capture, you will find it, and whose fault it is. Ben started off saying there's sometimes some finger pointing. That is the number one tool to make sure there's no finger pointing, because if there's a request coming across the wire and a response coming back, you know exactly what that request was. Was it formed properly? Was it the right information? And you can also see the request and make sure that you know exactly what that data looks like on the wire. No hiding again. So, and also the other good thing is, I mentioned timing is a big deal. Well, you can also see the timing of those communication packets as well. So if there's a huge delay between the request and the response, you will see that. And you can typically then point to, they're communicating fine, except for the fact that there's an expectation you're going to get a response back in, let's say, 2 seconds or 5 seconds or 10 seconds. And in fact, you're getting it back a minute later. And guess what? That device that sent the request has moved on to something else. And they expect that you're not even talking because you're not on the network. That's what they expect. So those are the kinds of things, again, you cannot hide from a data capture. It's It's basically foolproof, but it does require quite a bit of expertise to understand what you're looking at. That's why it's important to get the right service provider, get the right eyes on it, and that can absolutely help you out. Okay? So those are the top 3 helpful tools, I would say, with diagnosing or troubleshooting issues after the fact. But the bottom line is, let's try to make sure that we're educated to prevent these things in the first place. So that's the goal. All right? Any other questions for Ben and I? War stories?
Chris, just
Yep.
a comment on the wire captures. We recently had a case where, I'm not gonna mention the Bacnet client name because it doesn't matter. Our customer was getting results from their Bacnet client, and again, pointing fingers back at us. And, you know, we used Wireshark to do a capture. We could see exactly what that client was asking for, exactly what was being responded.
Yep. No hiding, right? No hiding.
No hiding.
No hiding.
There's, you know, apparently there's some processing and massaging going on, or combining of attributes in the Bacnet client.
Okay.
To come up
You
with-
saw that? Yep. You can see it on the wire. You know exactly
you can see it on the
what
wire.
happened. Right. Now, you don't know why. That's the only thing with a data capture. You see the trouble, but you don't know why. And of course, that's the next step then, is to talk to a programmer or somebody who understands the code, figure out why that happened.
Or in this case, we could see that the raw data was completely accurate.
Okay.
And you know, some massaging is going on, or some combining of data in the Bacnet client.
Right.
To come up with whatever's being presented.
Right. Good. Yeah, it's a good example. Very good. Very real world. See it all the time, unfortunately. Yeah, sure. Sure. Okay. Good. Well, thank you, and have a great rest of the show. Thanks.